Yes.
Yeah, two giant frogs. Okay. All right. So the next source, I will not lie, I really love this source. This is in Leviticus Rabbah on Parashat Acharei Mot. But it is also talking about the Akedah, but from Sarah's perspective. So ask yourself questions of, there's two different ways to ask questions. What is Sarah saying? What is she feeling? But even more importantly, why are the rabbis writing in a female voice? Right? What do they gain by writing in Sarah's voice that they couldn't do by writing in Abraham or Isaac's voice? And what does this tell us that they think about the Akedah? So those are two different ways of looking at the Akedah. We're going to break into groups, and then we'll come back and talk about them together before we go into two other fantastic texts. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or things they're upset about? Mindy? I can't hear you, though.
I couldn't make it work. I'm not upset about it, but I've just always been curious as to what makes somebody allowed to make a midrash that really goes on record. I could make up a story too, but I don't have the authority to do that in the way that people who really can make them do.
So all the midrashim, that's a great question. How does midrash rise to the level of rabbinic literature? How does midrash make it into the canon, right, of what we consider authoritative? So all the texts that we're going to look at today are pretty old. The oldest one that we're going to look at, I think, is the 11th and 12th century, which is a late Jewish text, right? That's late. So usually texts and stories, midrash doesn't make it into the canon until well after someone's died, right? I think it'll be different in the age of internet. I also think that we don't tend to write in stories in the same way. This genre of writing midrash isn't as popular, although I know people who do this. And certainly one of the times that you can see a lot of midrashim is right now. There's a lot of midrashim that have been written on what happened last October 7th. There's another woman who was popular maybe 30 years ago. Anyone read books by Joe Milgram? So she's an educator and an artist, and she wrote a book called Handmade Midrash, where she taught seminary for a while. She teaches people to use paper and art as a way of doing midrash. And maybe the most modern midrash that gets accepted are songs, right? Poetry that gets put into song. Anyone else want to? Okay. We're ready to break into groups and just discuss the text. And again, what we're looking for, or what are the different approaches that these rabbis are taking to how we interact with God, or how a person, a Jew, could interact with God. And L'chaim. So I guess like 20 minutes? Yeah. 15 minutes. Okay, so let's go back many centuries ago so that we don't have to think about today right now. That's one way of just bury your head for a little bit in sacred text. So how about someone reads this one? Achar hadvarim ha'eleh. So that is the first word of the Akedah story. And as I translated it 2 weeks ago, literally it's after these things occurred, but it's really functions more like a once upon a time kind of literary.
But that's the reason for the midrash. What happened? What are the things that happened?
That's right. What after which things?
Right.
So I was saying to someone that this is like, have any of you seen Wicked yet?
Not yet.
Okay, this is the prequel. This is what happens before the Akedah. So could someone read it with some
I'll
feeling?
read it. I'm happy to read it.
Amora Ellen?
Okay. Sometime afterward, Isaac and Ishmael were quarreling with each other. One, Ishmael, saying, I am more beloved than you, for I was circumcised at 13 years old. And one, Isaac, saying, I am more beloved than you, for I was circumcised at 8 days old. Ishmael said to him, I am more beloved than you, for I had reason to protest and did not. At that time, Isaac said, if only the Blessed Holy One would appear to me and tell me to cut off one of my limbs, I would not hesitate. Immediately, God put Abraham to the test.
Anyone feel like they're in like preschool?
Exactly.
So did anything, before I start asking questions, what comes up for you about this text?
Well, what comes up for me is that I think the commentator got it wrong here. I think God put Isaac to the test, maybe through Abraham.
Okay.
Okay, so
I mean, they're generally seen as the tests of Abraham.
Right, but Isaac's the one who's made the bravado of cut off my limb. So
Yeah.
God's one-upping him through Abraham.
So you're saying the way this story plays out, it should have been a test of Isaac. He was the one taunting Ishmael. Yeah.
He's the one who made this, not merely taunting Ishmael, but he, if you'll excuse the anthropomorphism, came to God's ears, and God said, all right, through Abraham, I will put Isaac to the test.
Thing.
But how else do you explain Isaac being, not merely asking where's the sheep, but then being laid out on the altar?
You
I
mean
think
That's what I think this midrash is getting at.
so we had somewhat of a different interpretation that I, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this, because they were like having what would be called in some circles a pissing contest.
Right.
Where, I did something better than you, no, I did something better than you. And, but, what we pointed out was that neither of them actually had to do anything that was, really required them to submit in a significant way.
that's like
but
what Stephen was saying.
but the idea of being tested was raised. And so God, hearing this, puts Abraham to the test, because he's the one that has to really prove his faith. I hope I got that right, Moshe.
Yes,
And-
our conclusion was that it was really Abraham who was put to the test.
yeah.
But I felt it's like both of them were in it together, that Isaac and Abraham were willing to,
show their loyalty,
or yeah, but
to
and
submit.
right. So it kind of explains why Isaac submitted, because it was like
But we don't actually know how Isaac responded.
Well,
I'm just saying, according to this midrash, he didn't.
No,
Well,
but I'm just saying from the story.
right.
we know from other midrashim that he was a willing participant.
Was a willing participant.
Willing.
Yes.
I
And
mean-
if you look at this in another way other than what we were talking in our group, we were all taught when we were little kids that wasn't Abraham such a great person because he did exactly what God said, and that's why God, but in actuality, we don't do those things. And the real moral of the story is that you don't do those things. You don't kill anybody for God. We don't make human sacrifices. We don't cut off our limbs, but that's not rewarded.
So but what the story is saying is the willingness to do so, the submission, the willingness, and remember, we're trying to think about not only the story, but why the rabbis wrote the story. What was missing? What did they want to be teaching that is in this story?
So maybe he was, if the way I look at it is they were arguing and trying to say, I'm better than you. And that's when God said, okay, well, I'm going to have your father now, follow up on what you think is something you would do.
I
So,
think,
go
I
ahead.
think they want to explain, the rabbis, they want to explain why Abraham was arguing with God about Sodom and Gomorrah and are so quiet and submissive here. So
Is
uh,
this or
they try to explain why. And
You can make that argument.
Right, he's trying to explain why. And I also want to just historically bring up that this is written right around the early Christianity,
Mm,
where the Christians were promulgating an idea that Isaac was sacrificed,
mm,
right? For Christians and Muslims, a sacrifice did happen just later in history.
I take it the story, Ishmael comes best, better than Yitzhak, because Ishmael has a good argument. And when Yitzhak is coming, he just said, if God will ask me, but it's only words. I mean, you don't know really whether he will
that's the test.
agree. So Ishmael comes much stronger in his belief than Isaac.
Well, yes, but I think they both come off as having this contest of who can submit more to God.
mhm,
And that for the rabbis of this time, they read the Akedah as unreasonable. Mindy, they read it as unreasonable.
mhm.
They have to find a way to give a story to say, no, it was reasonable. They were showing their loyalty to God.
Interesting.
But then Maimonides interpreted as being a teaching against human sacrifice.
Right. So
that Abraham should not have taken it.
Right. So the reason we're bringing these four texts here is that each one of them shows a different way of looking at the Akedah. There's not one right way. We don't have Rambam today. We don't have Maimonides today. We have four really divergent views of what the Akedah through Jewish history has said. We could look at Maimonides. We have before, but we're not going to today. Today we have these two different Breshit rabbis, and then we have a text that we don't often use, the Crusades. And I would love to get to text 2 if anyone is okay. Yeah.
Read it if you want.
So this, again, as just a sikum, this text from the 3rd to 5th century is really representing the idea that the ancient rabbis think that this story is about submission to God, about loyalty. It's not how it's going to be later in Jewish history. So you are going to read Leviticus Rabbah, which is written probably around the same time.
Okay. When Isaac returned to his mother, she said to him, "Where were you, my son?" He said to her, "My father took me and brought me up mountains and brought me down hills." She said, "Woe to the son of the wretched woman. Were it not for the angel from heaven, you would already be slaughtered." He said to her, "Yes." At that moment, she screamed 6 cries, corresponding to the 6 shofar blasts, and she died before she managed to finish.
So there are a whole bunch of these fabulous stories that try to give a reason why Sarah dies in the very next parsha, at the beginning of the very next parsha after. This text is trying to emphasize that the Akedah is something that caused pain and tragedy, right? Someone did die. What they're saying is, okay, Isaac may not have died from it, but his mother did.
What about this, the six shofar blast? We got stuck sort of on that. What does that mean?
What do you mean? What does it mean?
Well, so there are more, there are not really six shofar blasts. Unless we just say she cried out, she screamed 6 times before she managed to finish all of her crying.
Well, I don't know why it's. What did
Like
you
we
say?
we could name the 4 that we know on the high holidays, but we didn't know that there were 6. What is 6 shofar blasts?
Ah. There are 6 different times during Musaf when the shofar is blown.
And so it's 6 times of all of the blasts.
But
Also, it says where before she managed to finish. What was she going to finish? Were there supposed to be more than 6? Was she going to finish saying something? Was she going to be finished screaming and making more shofar blast analogs? Not sure.
she's gonna rage back at Isaac and at Abraham. Why do you think the rabbis wrote this story, and why did they write it in the voice of Sarah? Because it's unusual.
Why is it in Parashat Acharei Mot? It's not even Genesis.
Because it's Acharei Mot, it's about the death of the sons. So it's about how we respond to death. Is the connection.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So why the woman? Right? There's got to be a reason why the woman, because we don't often put words, the rabbis don't often put words into women's.
I question the part that says, woe to the son of the wretched woman, almost as if she was blaming herself, that she's the wretched woman and her son was going to suffer in a way, she's accepting blame for it, maybe. I mean, she refers to herself as the wretched woman.
Yeah, also at other times in at this time in Jewish history, also God is the man and Am Yisrael is the woman. So the wretched woman could be all of Am Yisrael at this point. But either way, you could read it. Bob?
Well, I have answer to both those. She is the wretched woman because she signed up to be the partner of this fellow who first trades her off to the Pharaoh, and only God's intervention kept her from being part of his harem for at least a night. And then he goes off in this with his loyalties to Hagar and Ishmael. And finally, this, where he actually agrees to sacrifice the son, to which such, give me how he got his name, and I laughed. How Sarah. Well, in any case, and then in terms of he is indeed the woe to the son, because he's somewhat of a Schlemiel of a patriarch. I mean, he's sort of like I'm not sure how if one of the missing stooges or something. Sorry, guys, he's my patriarch too, but he just doesn't have a role. And then look at his relationship to Rebecca. I mean, she's going to take the birthright away from the firstborn son, and he's just sort of, oh yeah.
Right.
So he is indeed.
I agree with you that he is a difficult character and is a hard one of the patriarchs. But I want to take you back to this question of why did the rabbis in the 3rd to 5th century write this story about trauma in Sarah's voice?
How about to account for her death soon thereafter?
That's what I was.
I think it addresses the feelings of a mother towards a child, and the loss of a child is so traumatic for her.
Right, but I would believe it would be traumatic to the father as well.
But the
Yeah, but
mother
he was
gave birth.
sort of the one who was acting out the sacrifice. So she's the one that's left out, doesn't have a say, finds out about it later, and it really kills her to find out. So I don't know how the rabbis thought about it, but it's certainly a
Yeah.
maternal.
Yeah, I agree with Myra. Do you think that it's written in the woman's voice because she's the one who gave birth, and her connection with him is a strong one. Not that fathers aren't, but we're reading it with a modern eye now. So she's the one that gave birth, and he was and he was, this could have been his death.
But was her death.
It was her death.
But instead was her death. Instead, like, it's again, I believe this is the rabbis in the 3rd to 5th century saying the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, was not without consequences. We see at the end of the binding of Isaac, okay, Abraham goes home, Isaac stays in Israel, gets a wife, builds a family, and the rabbis are coming back and saying, you can't have God, you can't have that kind of trauma without there being some consequence to it. The consequence to it is this woman died from it.
Yeah.
Which it's an indictment of God a little bit.
Can I say something?
You can, but I want to just reinforce what I just said. I believe this text is the rabbis of the 3rd to 5th century turning back to the text of the Akedah and saying, God, you should have never asked Abraham to do this.
Why a woman voice?
Right.
So
So
the
let
women
me ask you something. Why the woman's voice? What? Okay. So obviously there's an element of how we treat women in society here, but even today, they're making these lists right now of which of the hostages are going to come out. And so they put the women on first. And I feel so bad for all the mothers and fathers who have a son there. Their son isn't as valuable, but there's something historically that, I don't know. I mean, look, it's sexism. We know that. But there's some way of saying, if you're going to argue with God, you can turn around to God and say, look what you did. You killed this nice woman. It's easier to argue with God when you're arguing over the death of the nice mama bear. Michelle.
I mean, I think that it's in the voice of a woman because a woman would never have agreed to that. She would have been there arguing with God. She wouldn't have accepted it.
That's what I
I mean, and when she screams, I mean, it's like I think the shofar blasts, represent like an acknowledgement of the power of God, but at the same time she's screaming. So it's like kind of those are like crashing into each other and it kills her. Like she can't.
I'm not sure if they're the power of God. I think they're more her. They're her. The shofar blasts are her trauma that she has from this.
It is, but the tekiah represents, I mean, maybe it didn't then. I mean, but it's acknowledging God's power. I mean, in the shofar on the high holidays, certainly, and I mean that
I was going to talk about
say
it.
shofar blast and just instead of just saying she was screaming. What does that add? It adds like kind of a sense of that her screaming is also at the same. She acknowledges God's power, but she's screaming against God. I think, in a way.
Okay, buy it. Moshe?
I was talking about it too, but when you say that she's screaming keneged shesh tkiot against the 6 blowing the shofar, she's screaming at God. Because the same way that our prayers on Kippur are, the Tkiyot is talking to God, she's screaming at God, and because of that, she's being punished. And again, I don't like it.
And but if she's screaming at God, she's screaming at God and saying, how could you ask
You dare lie.
Abraham, how dare you ask Abraham to do this?
Right.
But who's really doing the screaming here?
The rabbis.
The rabbis in the third century.
But it's very cowardly to put it in a woman voice.
Right. That's right. That's
But one
that's
of
exactly
the-
right.
One of the
Like they are so nervous about saying it in their own voice,
Mm.
so they'll put it in the woman's voice.
Oh,
But
okay.
it's not, it is what they think. And we know that because this is one of many stories. One that I like equally or is where Satan himself comes to Sarah and then jumps off of a roof because she thinks it did happen. But really, it's the rabbis after the expulsion, right? The temple's destroyed. We're not going back. Things are not good for the Jews. And the rabbis are turning around and saying, God, why did you let this happen? Look at all this trauma. And in light of the history of the Jewish people, we're going to read two other sources right now that are even a little bit more critical of God, if there could be. So how about we go on to the next few? Is that okay? And then we can look at all of them unless anyone has something they want to say. I would love to hear some of it being read in beautiful Hebrew, but okay. So the next text is 11th and 12th century. And it's supposed to be eyewitness accounts of the Crusades. So Jewish eyewitness accounts of the Crusades as they go to overtake Jerusalem from Muslim rule. On their way, the Crusaders are massacring Jewish communities. And this account, where I'm told, comes from Germany. So we're in Germany, the little Vorspeise of Jews being massacred in Germany, a millennial later. And it's not really written as a commentary, but it's written as this is the result of the Akedah. So that's what we're going to read in the third. And it's really about, think of it in light of Jews are suffering. And so we see the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, in light of Jews suffering. And they were in the middle of the Crusades. Okay, so the next one is a midrash, and it is an earlier midrash, so 8th or 9th century, and you are gonna find it quite interesting to read. It's interactive, and you might want to have assigned parts to all the parts there. And it's really about the merit of the Jewish people. So I think these are really creative texts, and we're going to send you away unless anyone has anything to ask or say. First one is about Crusader Chronicles. So Jews and suffering, 11th and 12th century. So it's taking into account the history of Jews suffering in light of the
On
Akedah.
suffering, they were on the Akedah there. They were like on the Akedah there because they think themselves.
Yes, they were ne'akad al hamizbeach.
Right.
Yeah, they see that the sacrifice of Isaac did happen through them.
Yeah.
And if you're living through a crusade or the Shoah or a pogrom, thank God we're not. That might be how we see this text. Meaning, I think this text, well, you'll read the third text. I think it stands for today. And then you'll read the Tanhuma. And it's going to be, why didn't he speak up? So let's go into groups and we'll come back. Was that enough time for people? Okay, so first, oh, is everyone back? Did you like these texts? Were they different from most texts you've read? Their format?
I really liked the second one done in dialogue, in
Yeah.
play form. I like that. It was fun and actually easier to unpack. And yes,
I had a
these are-
question about the first one, because you mentioned reading it in Hebrew, so I started to myself reading the first one in Hebrew, and I was asking, is there a typo? Do they repeat the first phrase without completing it?
היו 1,100 עקידות ביום אחד, כולם כעקדת יצחק.
Ben, and then
not
it starts over again.
Yeah. It might be. What do you think?
Hold on.
I think it is because it doesn't end. Ben, what?
Right,
It doesn't
exactly.
end. Yeah.
Or it could be Ben like between.
I thought that, but doesn't that have a yud in it?
No. Between you need the yud between the bet
But
and
I'm
the.
saying maybe the problem was not that they repeated, but a missing yud.
Oh. I don't think so. The sentence makes no sense. Yitzchak Bain, and that's it. Make no
Yeah.
sense.
And then they start out with
No,
the
it's ka'akedot Yitzchak. That's
But it was
Ben.
saying that
Haim
Yitzchak
hayu
Ben.
1,100 akedot.
maybe. I don't think so, but maybe. We need to check the
I will check the original.
Yeah.
I'll go into Safari after this and check the original. Okay, so this text is like angry, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. But it's angry at current events, or at least current events of the time that it was written.
Well, but also God.
Well, it's angry at God, but yes, but it's angry because of the current events. It's not angry because of the original Akedah. It's angry. We just had 1,100 Akedahs and nothing happened.
Mm.
Well, right. So God was so upset and it was such a big deal for there to be one. God, why the heck are you letting 1,100? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or 6
Fundamental.
million.
Yeah.
Mm.
I don't know.
This is using the Akedah to turn around and yell back at God and say, why are you letting all this happen? Why are you letting Jewish suffering happen?
Mm.
Yeah.
For me, the one thing I questioned was the Akedah is biblical in the Torah.
Mhm.
The Crusades were history, and they not that I'm doubting the Akedah, but they're bringing up something that actually happened,
Yeah.
and we know happened.
Well, but they're writing it
They're
contemporaneous.
writing at the time of
That's
the
what's
Crusade.
happening.
Yeah.
Well, I think the issue is that 1,000 years ago, people expected the supernatural to still happen, and that it didn't.
75 years ago, they expected the supernatural to happen.
Well, I mean, there are people today who expect the supernatural to
No,
happen.
I mean, people even who are not religious or who say, I'm not religious, and then say, why did God let the Holocaust happen?
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, that
And
came
really,
up in
it's-
our discussion also.
Why did the God that I don't believe in,
Mhm.
I mean, let the Holocaust happen is usually more accurate. So, I mean, you're right. There's definitely more of a faithful community at this time, 1,000 years ago, and they're angry. And they're angry at God.
Rightfully so.
Right. I wonder, and I will ask some of my Christian theologian friends, I wonder how normal it is for Christian saints to yell at God.
Hmm.
I know it doesn't happen in
Okay.
Islam.
You know,
So what I'm getting at is this is a model of Jews throughout the ages saying one fair way of being faithful to God is to be angry with God. And Stephen, as you noted, it's for people who still believe that God will intervene in history in supernatural ways. But even to write this, for some could seem heretical. Who's angry at God?
Oh, people expecting miracles to still happen. And when it doesn't, I mean, you have two choices here. You either stop believing or you're angry that for whatever reason God did not intervene. Maybe there are other ways you can go out of that, but those seem the two obvious ones to me.
Oh,
Anyone
people
else?
can be angry at their own fate regardless of whether they call it God or not. You know, if the Crusades are going on and the people are saying, well, why is this happening to me? They can be angry about why that's happening to them without the next step of saying God should be here to help me.
Well, I that is certainly absolutely true, but if you live in a time where God is perceived to be ever present and not as remote as us 21st century beings, then why hasn't God appeared and done supernatural things?
And the next line is, this is an amazing example of Jews in Jewish history saying it's okay to be angry with God.
And question.
Yeah. Also, this is now I am going back to Rambam. Like, I find it difficult when people say the words ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema. I believe with perfect faith, and then whatever they say after. I think that's like, you know, the phrase "the lady doth protest too much." Like when you're in a community and you have to beat on the table and your mantra is, I believe with perfect faith. I believe with,
Something is going on.
yeah.
But anima amin is you believe in the coming of the Mashiach, who will
There-
save you
there's a-
ultimately.
No, but there are lots of anima means.
Okay.
So you were saying you were going to ask your Christian theologian friends. I mean,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, in one of the Gospels, when Jesus is on the cross, he asked God why he's being forsaken.
Eli, Eli.
Why have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
My God, my God.
Well, that's modern.
Fine, but
No, the Mindy one.
right, that's the one. That was the Michelle one too. They were both. But I'm pretty sure that that's in at least one of the Gospels. So there's somebody, of course, you could still argue that Jesus was Jewish at that point. It was only afterwards that.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, right.
Wow.
Christianity isn't formed till like 100 years later, and then it's only the beginning, right?
But they're at the very root of the New Testament is somebody who's angry at God.
Okay.
Yeah, it says it's in the New Testament.
Thank you.
Do
All
you
right.
want to
I don't know. I haven't found a New Testament. I just found references to it on Google.
What's the date of the next source, Rabbi, if we're moving on to that?
Midrash Tanhuma is 9th century, I think. Let me go look
So
up
it's
that
still not.
stuff again.
The 9th century would be the 800s.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, 8th or 9th century. And it's a maybe. It's one of those books that we don't necessarily know the dating of,
Mhm.
but not before the 8th or 9th century.
Actually, it looks like the Hebrew is in the New Testament.
Mhm.
It says about 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. And then it says, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?
I'm pretty sure though the writers of this text didn't know that one.
Oh, this text.
That's quite probably true, but I just wanted to point. You were,
Yeah, no, thank you.
And this is thanks to my taking a course with Rabbi Max Tickton on a Jewish perspective on the New Testament. Otherwise,
Thank
I
you.
would never read the entire New Testament.
Okay, so I assume that people liked the Tanhuma because of how it's written.
Mhm.
But also, I mean, not only is it dialogue, but also there's argument here.
Yeah. Do you want to hear it? Someone want to play the parts?
We did that.
Did we all do that in our individual?
Did everyone do that in their groups?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, it's unusual because it's an interactive God and a person. That makes it quite unusual. And also, Abraham's silent through a lot of it.
I don't know, he's asking.
I'm sorry, who did you say was?
I don't see him silent through
No,
it.
I don't
see
think he's silent either.
he's asking, God says yes. God says, through eyes, responds in short
Right.
responses.
Right. It's short. It's clipped.
Mm-hmm. And then Abraham has that good soliloquy there.
Right. It's like God and Abraham are negotiating.
Mhm. Or that Abraham's finding holes in God's thinking, like you said I was going to that
Be a
my
father of
offspring
great
will be as
nations.
many as the stars, right? And if that's so, if you said that, who's that going to be through? And God says through Isaac. And so then Abraham plays it out. And did you not tell me
Then
that
you can't sacrifice Isaac.
Mhm, right.
Right.
It's a smart argument.
Some
in
people
a
think
way
that this is the argument of Avraham knew throughout the entire Akedah that it was a farce.
It makes sense. I mean, I never thought of that before, but it's incongruent to think that God said you're going to multiply the earth and then take away the source of that.
Right.
I don't know if Abraham knew, but we supposed to know.
Yeah.
Right. So we don't need to say, how could God let that
Right.
happen?
Right.
We know the story.
Well, when we first read it, we don't know the story, right?
But that's the thing. You first read this story when you're in 3rd grade. To them, they know this story. The rabbis who are writing the Tanhuma have grown up, they know this story by heart. And they really know it because it's in the davening every day. All of in the regular Siddur for the weekday davening, it has those 20-some verses of the binding of Isaac. They know this story. So it's really, what's the shofar here?
Yeah, right. That's
Right.
the interesting part is how we get from I mean, other than explaining the ram, how do we get from this argument to the shofar? And that seemed a little of a stretch to me, but maybe that's
So
my
God asks
reading.
Abraham to suspend his arguments and to just perform the Akedah. Okay, and similarly, Abraham asked God to suspend whatever legitimate arguments God has against the Jewish people each year at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur
Yeah.
with the shofar. We hear the shofar, and God, just like Abraham did what you asked, you need to now forgive us, even though we are not worthy. Aval chatanu, right? But we have sinned. We know we have sinned. Okay, but Abraham, our father, he had enough sense or faith to stop and to do what you've asked. We're turning it around back at God and saying, okay, on the high holidays, big shot, now forgive us. And what's crazy about that is that it's a negotiation.
Like Sodom and Gomorrah, though, right?
Yeah.
I think
Except-
it's a payment that Abraham asked God, listen, I did it for you, now you did it for all the children of Isaac. So that's kind of a payback.
Yeah, for us. By the way, I mean, there's another religious tradition that has a patriarch that does something for its people, right? Christianity.
Oh, yeah.
No.
Life.
It's a different thing that he does. He dies.
He actually dies, but all right.
He gives his life for their sins, and yeah.
I mean, they read the Akedah into that story. And we thankfully can live with an Akedah where Isaac isn't sacrificed. So the Sikkum is that these are just 4 samplings of ways that Jews over generations have argued or interacted with God. Some of them were angry or sad. Some of them see negotiation. The Sarah one is a little bit more anger and trauma. And that really, these texts are the lived experience. You could go back, you asked the question, Mindy, about Midrash. You could go back and write a Midrash on the Akedah right now. I would love to read that at some point, or anyone here could. And there's a lot of them being written in the last year, right? A lot of Israeli parents are writing.
A lot of literature in Hebrew that deals
lot.
with Akedah, modern.
Yep. I guess one of the ending things I would like people to think about and that I'd say is each one of us here could have a different relationship. Even if you're married to someone here, you could have a different relationship with God than the person sitting next to you, than your mother, your brother, or you 5 years ago. You may be at the sadness part or the anger part. And that's more of the personal discerning. If you want to be in that, you can see this just as a historical lesson of this is how Jews thought, or you can also see this as these are ways that I could relate to God. Either one. I'm going to stop. I'm going to stay on. If anyone wants to talk about anything, I'm happy to tell you anything about my trip last week, or you could be bored by that and just come next week and have scotch. That I